Welcome to Becoming the Business,
People in the developing world are
where we unpack the messy, meaningful side of building something real.
the younger generations coming into the working world. They've got a lot of fears and anxiety. We're Caroline and Liska, coaches, thinkers, and longtime friends, having honest conversations about work, identity, leadership, and everything in between. Way more open to entrepreneurship.
Whether you're growing a business, navigating change, or figuring out who you are in the process,
You're in the right place.
this is Becoming the Business.
Hey Liska!
Hey Caroline, it's good to see you again. You've been away.
I've been in sunny England because it's been super hot. They had a big heat wave and it was such an interesting trip for me. Living in a developing country and then going back to see my family, and really interesting to see how people are feeling, what they're fearful of, what they're hopeful about. A little bit different to what's happening here in South Africa where we live. So that was very interesting for me. Also, interestingly, I spent time with people from France and heard about their perspective on what's happening in France, and then their opinion on what's happening in Germany. So I had a few really good conversations about people's perspectives in the developed countries versus where we are at the moment. So that was insightful.
What were some of your key takeaways from the conversations that you're having?
Yeah, so the thing that hit me the most was I have some nephews who are entering the working world. So they've graduated, and my nephew was telling me how he'd applied everywhere to try and get a job, and he's been struggling, and he says of all his friends who've just graduated, he says 5 of them have definite jobs lined up. And so I asked him, how about starting something on your own? And he was immediately, resistant and hesitant. And he said, I don't have the skills. I wouldn't even know where to start. And that's kind of just not what you do. You go into employment straight away. You get a degree to be employable. And so that was a great conversation, because I'm of the school of you can do anything and start your own thing, and it doesn't cost you money necessarily. All you just need is a warm audience, and an offer, and take it from there. So, he'd done some editing. He'd had a few summer jobs doing some video editing for people. And I said, well, start with that. People have already paid you. So, there's a demand, you got the skill, you can deliver. Start with that and then scale. And so we had some really good conversations about that. And it gave me the impression that the youth, the younger generation who's coming into the working world, they've got a lot of fears and anxiety. And I'm feeling really hopeful for this generation, because now there's opportunities everywhere.
So there's a lot of sort of sentiment around jobs changing and the working world also becoming a place that people are not necessarily prepared for. And there's questions about whether the education that people have got is actually suited to the skill set required for the new world that we're all moving into. And then there's, of course, this whole entrepreneurial wave where anyone can start a business anywhere with a phone and a website. And yet you're touching on something where there's still a need to go into a place that is established to learn something. And so I'm curious about this idea of anyone can start anything anywhere and learn as you go along, as opposed to also being in an environment where you are an employee and you learn how systems work, you learn how structures are put in place. And so I suppose I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that.
So I'm going to answer the question with a little bit of a story. So my nephew was telling me about his worries, and then my father, who's been retired for a long time, who is an avid newsreader, was telling him, this is the hardest time to be a graduate, because now all the entry-level jobs are now actually being taken over by AI. So those who are entering the working world don't have a spot in the world anymore. So there was that element, and then there was me going, no, you can do anything you want and you can. And so he was kind of thinking, well, your idea of you can do anything you want to is too airy-fairy and up in the air, and it's not tangible enough. But there are statistics on AI replacing people and jobs being taken. And so he was gravitating towards like, this is way more structured, and I understand these statistics better than your airy-fairy, you can start a business if you want to. So that was an interesting element of part of that conversation. But to answer your question, I think I would go into the basics that I've just said, which is, if you've got something that people are willing to pay for, start with that. So yes, you might be in your early 20s and you might have had very little exposure to the working world, but it just takes one thing. So even to give you a basic example, looking after foster cats or house sitting for people or anything like that will give you an edge over somebody who's really done nothing. So you just need that 10% edge, and you need to figure out what that is and then try and monetize it.
I think it's really good advice, because whether you're studying academically and going into a job as an employee, you still have to learn the job. And although you technically have managers or mentors within the system, you can actually create that for yourself within within an entrepreneurial space. And so I think it's really helpful to, in a way, transfer that perception of I have to go and get a job to, if I start a business, I can still simulate the same experience of development and growth and learning as I would as if I was in an organization. And I think that's where online communities become so useful, and building networks and all of that sort of thing. So that's possibly a way to help bridge the gap between being very fixated on I'm employable, I'm also entrepreneurial, and really those two things are the same thing. The first stage of the entrepreneurial ladder is to be an employee, and self-employment is the same as being employed by someone else. You just have to become a good manager of yourself.
Yeah.
So I also love what you're saying about figuring out one thing that you already have in your toolbox. So like you said, whether it's walking dogs or even being a waiter at a restaurant, to think about how the skill set you have could become monetized. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on sort of the monetization of a skill. How does someone start thinking about monetizing something? A lot of questions I often get asked is, well, how much should I charge?
Yeah.
Pricing is such a challenge when you're starting out.
Yeah. So I think there's got to be a demand. So if there's a demand and people are willing to pay for something, it's much easier to monetize that way. So looking at what other people are doing in the area that you're interested in. So if you've got a competitor or two, then that people are willing to pay for that service or that product, so you've got a basic amount of research done there. The basic research of, are people willing to pay for this? And then once you know that, your warm audience is your lowest hanging fruit. So you just go to if you're a 20-something-year-old, you go to your parents, your friends, your friends' parents, anybody who you could possibly get a network from. You go to them. And then I love the idea of community. I think that's something that has really been undervalued for a long time. And I think now more than ever, entrepreneurs need the support of communities. So I would say look at joining your local business community, local groups, Facebook groups, or anything like that, or even start hanging out with people who are already trying to do what you're doing. University students, one of my other nephew was telling me how this person would organize events and parties, and that skill he's transferred into the new area he's at. So there is always something, and you just really mustn't underestimate what that is. So the monetizing part is understanding that there's a demand for it. And then in terms of how to price it, That's always a tricky one. And I have to admit that I also struggle with that. The more offers you put out, the more information and feedback you get in terms of how viable that offer is. So there's never a right and a wrong. I think you got to just put it out there. Different offers, guarantees, money back, or upsells, cross sells, and things like that. It's testing and measuring. So I know there's no real answer, because you sort of have to put it out there in order to know if it's right or not.
I mean, it depends on how innovative your product or service is. You know, if there's already an existing market and you're becoming a new player in the market, there's benchmarks you can make use of. I think people often struggle with their value, especially if they're doing something for the first time. They don't know whether they're good enough, or from a, service point of view anyway, there's this, do I charge a rate that says I'm first year out of university and I can do it at a more reasonable price, so I therefore I kind of get market share because I'm offering it at a lower price. But then people soon realize that they can't service the demand at that price, and that's where economics come into the picture. But I think the major question is building the confidence to think of yourself as entrepreneurial as opposed to only employable.
Yes.
And really, I suppose something we're wanting to stimulate and challenge is the mindset, the opportunity to become an entrepreneur, to be a business owner, and to really, I suppose, encourage people to think that that is possible, and then to begin asking how and not if.
Yes. So one of the things that came out when I was talking to my nephew was that he's had to try and sell himself to become employed. So I said to him, well, you when you were an entrepreneur and you're doing your own thing, you got to try and sell yourself as the provider and whatever service or product you're selling as well. So there's that selling element in both at the moment when you're trying to find work. And he was like, oh yeah, I didn't actually think about that. So all of these things that you're putting towards potentially being employed are also very relevant when you're setting up your own business or thinking about starting.
Absolutely. But I think there's still that very traditional mindset of I need to find a job that's posted. There's jobs out there that are posted, like, accounts receivable manager or clerk or whatever it is, and then I go and look for that job, and then I apply for the job that's been put out there. So again, it's the demand supply dynamic of, am I going out there to look for something that someone else has requested, or do I go and say, which business do I want to apply for a job at, or what business would I like to start? So it's very much a shift from actually an external locus of control to developing more of an internal locus of control. That thing of, where can I identify something inside of myself that is valuable and that has meaning and purpose attached to it, and can I put it out there? So there's a lot of confidence that comes with being able to do that. And again, with starting a business, it doesn't matter when you do it. It's about doing it, and the confidence comes afterwards, and not waiting for the confidence to be there before you take the risk.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that, I think there's a lot of fear associated with that. But how do you start thinking of yourself as employable or entrepreneurial from an internal point of view? How do you start thinking about yourself as someone who has something to offer, whether it's, I can offer you my services as an employee, or I can offer something that's valuable that I can sell? I'm curious about, you were talking about the differences between what's going on in the developing world versus the developed world, and then different contexts in England and in France. And what are some of your insights around that?
So a couple of things. So there are people in the developing world are way more open to entrepreneurship than this is my opinion, than they are in Europe, for example. And so to me, that was really, really, from senior citizens as well as the young guys I was talking to. There's definitely a difference between this mindset of anybody can do anything. I feel that it's way more developed in the developing country, which is so interesting to me. So when I was in the UK and around different nationalities, there's very little talk of opportunities and potential and the world is your oyster, and there's none of that. Whereas in the developing countries, there's way more of that. So that was the one of the biggest things that was really surprising to me.
Just on that, I mean, my thought immediately was survival often breeds creativity. And obviously leads to criminal activity as well at times, you know, and so that's the tension that we live with in our context is, you know, that kind of need to survive can either lead to this creative opportunity seeking and hustling in a sense and making a plan, the boermaker plan idea, you know, that's something that South Africans are really well known for. But then the obviously the other side of that is the risk taking that's involved with that and the fear of the unknown and what needs to be done to make something happen. And I think in some ways where there's a lot of structure and a lot of regulation, and I know people South Africans who've moved abroad to various developed countries have found it incredibly difficult to start businesses because of all the compliance and regulation. And so I think that's also a reality for a lot of people, is how to overcome some of those bureaucratic components of being in a developed nation.
There are also more schemes to help startups. So it's funny because there's actually more structure to help people get started in the developed worlds than there are here. So it's really interesting to me how it's just a mindset. And I completely agree with you. Like when you have zero option and you need food on the table, you will go and do whatever it takes to make sure that you can feed your family or just have a roof over your head. So, and I see that a lot here where we live is we support a seamstress, for example, who's a lady who works in an area that's not particularly nice, she's had to move and out of being forced out of moving out of where she used to be to this new place, and it's not a great new place. It's half the amount of space that she has, but she's got her little sewing machine and her family just do what they need to. And I love that. I love the fact that it's like making the most of what needs to be done and doing it really well. She's brilliant at what she does, and she offers there's a brilliant customer service there, even though it's a very low cost service. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, you know, we're talking to different audiences here, and one of those audiences are like your nephew as an example, someone who's reached the end of their sort of formal education phase and are currently going, what do I do with my life? What do I do with myself occupationally? And actually reaching ceilings or sort of roadblocks in what was perceived, the sort of illusion of this is what I'm going to do. And there's often a big feeling of disillusionment where you think something's going to be like this and then it doesn't work out that way. And then having to reimagine reality and go, well, actually, what is the reality? The reality is I'm not finding work. What do I do instead? And therein lies the opportunity, is in really coming to terms with the reality of what's going on, but then looking for alternatives. You've mentioned the fact that there actually are structures in place to actually facilitate and support entrepreneurial development or business development.
There are organizations that literally are there to help like in the UK still, previously disadvantaged individuals who need a little bit of direction. So there are actually tons and tons of organizations that are set up for that. I can't name any off the top of my head, but I can look into it. But the point is that there's way more help over there. Also for people who come from very difficult backgrounds. So it's ironic to me that there's more structure, but people are more resistant to it over there than they are in a developing country. where there's zero structure, but people just put their hand up and say, yeah, I'm going to try that and give it a go.
So I wonder if that's just, like you said, a mindset, and also a not knowing what one doesn't know.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's again what we're wanting to stimulate and encourage. There's a lot out there about how to scale businesses and how to, make the next billion-dollar tech business work. But I think there's so many layers to this entrepreneurial journey, right from starting up in like your seamstress in your backyard or in your garage, and starting something that is the beginning of the journey. It doesn't mean that that's going to be your product in 5 to 10 years from now. It's really about selling something and building something that then leads to something else and develops into something else. And so really just being open to the journey of beginning something and trying something, testing and measuring it, going, okay, I tried that, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Even some of the best tech products out there started with a minimum viable product that had to be tested and measured until the prototype was formed. And I think that happens inside of us as well as with the thing that we're selling.
So that's so interesting that you should say that, because my second daughter, who's still at university, decided to try and earn some cash, and she's quite creative, and so she spent her holiday creating an Etsy shop, and it suits her person. That's why I'm saying you got to pick something that really suits you. So she picked something. So it was Etsy shop, and it was printables, and it's for teachers' classroom decor. And she's been every day for a month, you've got to upload a new listing so that it recognizes that you're a real person. And I got a phone call last night as I was getting to bed going, Mom, I've just made my first sale and I've broken even. And I'm like, okay, so you've learned how to create products. You've learned how to put copy together in order to put the messaging to attract the right customer. And you now know what your break-even point is. And I'm like, this is amazing. You've now, in the space of 3 weeks, that's it. You can now do anything you want. And that's how simple it is. Mm-hmm. Just really basic, simple things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love the way that you are engaging with your children and your nephews about learning how to start a business, and really breaking it down to the sort of basic elements, the sort of building blocks, the bricks and mortar of it. And again, you describing, finding a place to sell, so creating a shop, whether it's an online thing or an actual brick and mortar store, finding out products that you can sell, and then finding ways to attract, customers through communicating with them, having copy, and then making the sale, and then understanding the financial aspects of that. How does one break even? What does that even mean? And I think that's really the elements that are required, all those little bits and pieces, and that happens through doing it.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen through theory.
Yeah. So when she said, oh, I've broken even. I said, okay, so what did Etsy take? What was their cut? And then she told me, and I was like, okay, so have you still broken even? She's like, yes, that's what I meant. So she's understood the concept also of, and that's also really important to understand the numbers and what has to go where in taxation and things like that. And that's, I every time I think about it and I talk to people, it's just going back to the basics. It's like, even if you're doing cold calls, it's sales, it's delivery of your service or product, and then it's customer service. Mm-hmm. And for me, I keep telling everybody, you need to be about customer service, because if you've got dissatisfied clients, you're not going to get more clients. So then I said to my daughter, you need to go and ask for a review from this person who's bought your product. That's the next step. And it's like, oh, I can't do that. It's uncomfortable. And I was like, but you need, that's how this platform works. It's like, you need to have 5-star reviews to get people to trust your product. So now it's building on that, and it's the next step. And it's, I was just excited that she was willing to put herself out there, but also to be consistent. Every day putting something new and having to be creative and being a bit resilient, because it's pretty easy, especially if you're on holiday, and saying, no, I don't want to do it today, I'd rather be doing something else. So it's doing things when you don't really want to do them as well. That's also part of this whole thing.
I think that the lovely part of it is also the reward that comes, you know, the feeling of that just worked, and then building on that, you know, really seeing what intrinsic reward comes from doing something and it actually working. That also builds the ability to have consistency in something, because you know, often people will do something for a long period of time and it doesn't work, and that can feel really discouraging.
Yeah.
But it's lovely to hear that she's actually had a result from her efforts, and that, you know, again, that also helps with the test and measuring, is that you might try something initially and it doesn't work, and then knowing when to stop that thing and try something else. And that's a really difficult tension to get right in the beginning. And again, I think that's where community and accountability is useful. She obviously has you to talk to, in a sense, coaching her through the process, where you're able to say to her, do more of this, or now try that. So that's, you know, it's a clear almost ingredient in becoming the business, is that you actually need someone in your corner who's helping you along the way, who's been on the path before, or, you know, having a community of other entrepreneurs who are interested and invested in the same kind of thing.
So you say that, but she was initially, I don't want you to look at the shop. I don't want you to, you know, I want to, so she was like, I want to try and do this on my own. I was like, that's great, you go for it. So but what she had done is she had chosen a competitor to look at and research properly. And that's what I'm talking about. Just what is the demand? What are people prepared to pay for? How much are they paying? And then putting something out there. But yeah, I mean, for me, the community aspect, having a coach on your side, always it wins hands down.
But I think what you're saying around competitor analysis is so critical. It's really being able to understand what is already out there, what is working, what's not, and then finding ways to put your unique selling proposition onto that product. That creates an offer for people out there who may not be buying the product yet because it doesn't suit them or doesn't connect with them in some way. And I think, again, that's where there's so much opportunity, because there are communities that are not being reached, in a sense. There are multiple customers out there that don't have a product that they like yet. And so to really think about how each person can actually put their own flair, identity, color in the lines the way that you would do it, and that's something that someone else would buy.
So we've been trying to figure this out with Surge Systems, or our new startup tech company, and we've spent pretty much 9 months putting offers out there to people, understanding how to communicate to non-technical people. And we just came out of this meeting, and one of the tech guys said, but you need to remember, we offer like this, there's this feature, this feature, this feature. And I said, I don't think people want the features necessarily at this point. They want to know what we can offer them and how we can put it together. And it was just the light bulb moment. And then he's like, oh yeah, okay, I guess, because our competitor has the same features. Like, it's feature to feature is not a big deal. It's what can you bring to it. And that's the development. That's why you need 9 months of figuring out, putting things out there and getting feedback from that. I think the theme has been basics. Starting with, it's not as complicated as you think it is. Just start. You can, no matter what you've got, no matter what your background, no matter who you are, you've got something to offer. It's just how to communicate that and how to understand how to price it and put it out there. I think that's the main message.
So we've been talking a lot about, you know, people who have never been employed before or who have never started anything before. But I've also come across a lot of people who've been in employed positions for a number of years, 15, 20 years, who are really wanting to make a change, often at midlife, where there's this, I've been doing this, and is this really what I've wanted to do? And how do I even make the transition to, you know, starting my own thing? And so I think these principles also apply to someone who's wanting to make quite a radical career change or occupational change. And so the same thing applies, you know, do you start something in the side hustle. And that's actually the ideal, where you've actually got an income, you've got almost cash flow to start feeding a business that can grow, on the side in its own way. So I think that those principles still apply. It's like, how do you explore where there's pain points in society? Where are the problems? Where are the things that really irritate you? And can you think of solving those problems in a way that you would? One thing I've been thinking about a lot is packing school lunches for my kids. They've been on school holidays, and thinking about the fact that I have to start preparing for that again. And I keep thinking, I wish there was somewhere I could order, my 5 days a week, a nice, nutritious, variable meal, and it all gets delivered in a box. And, there's a business right there. There's an opportunity for someone to solve a problem for me, because I want nutritious meals. I want it in as simple as, and I want my kids to eat it. Can you make sure that happens too, kind of thing? But, so therein lies the opportunity, is really listening into where your frustrations are in society, where there are pain points, where you could potentially be the one to solve them. And that applies to someone who's just come out of school or university, as much as to someone who is, trying to transition out of an office job 9 to 5. Starting a business is like, a next phase of life as well. It can represent a whole new career in and of itself. And I know a lot of people who've retired from, literally at 65, retired from 40 years of corporate life and have started a business at that point. And so the opportunity to start a business is actually open to anyone at any point of life. And it's really just about imagining yourself in a different role as opposed to an employee. I think being an employee and an entrepreneur have so many similarities in terms of the transferable skill sets that are there. The risk obviously feels more because you don't have that consistent income, but that also drives a certain behavior, and there's something exhilarating and enlivening about that. Well, it was lovely to chat to you and catch up with you again after your holiday and your adventures, and I know that you enjoyed some strawberries and cream, and
It's fabulous. And the hot weather was great.
Well, we'll be back next week.
Yes. Thanks for joining us on Becoming the Business. We hope today gave you something to chew on or talk about with someone you trust.
And if you're building something real, don't do it alone. We'll see you next time.